Hello, well, welcome everybody. I'm Maurice Davis, the Head of Collections at the Royal Academy, and this is Richard Deacon, RA. We've been working together, and particularly with my colleague Helen, who I can't see, who's at the back, for 2018, curate, I think is the common term everyone uses these days, but we always use music, to curate a selection of sculpture from the Royal Academy's collection that will run right along here and turn the corner. So this space is still called here the Dame Gillian Sackler Sculpture Gallery, but it has turned slightly into the foyer and shop area for the Sackler Gallery exhibitions. And along with Jill Sackler, I'm very keen that we do as much as we can to return it to being a sculpture gallery. And it's going to be a slightly two-stage process because there's another phase of work in a few years' time going to happen here. But in a way, the first stage is Richard has selected and working with our designer Adrian Gardere and with Helen worked out how to display things. But I think the idea is we're going to talk for about 3/4 of an hour and then chance for questions. And we're going to talk a bit about Richard's work and then we're going to talk about the sculpture display. I think that's the sequence. So,
and we should also say that the thing that is going to change up here is that the very first thing is that Tondo will move down out of this space and down to a different location in the Academy, when it will be not at the end of the road, but at a point where it's more central and symbolically and actually to the Academy. So one of the difficulties at the moment is that there's a really, really major work which is beautifully displayed in a purpose-built gallery space, but which is in the end of a journey, so that its importance as an object and its importance in relationship to the Academy isn't fully manifest, and also it's not as well lit as it could be, to be honest.
So, I'll start by talking about your work, which is about to start coming up again on the screen. I've been very interested talking to you as we've selected things, and I'm interested, this might seem like an intrusive or stupid question, but I'm interested in the kinds of things you're thinking about when you make sculpture. Not necessarily the actual things, but in a way the kind of territory your mind is going through as you're making things.
I think that depends really on at what point in the process you're at. I think that it mostly starts from things which are really quite simple, and it can often start from mistakes or thinking you're doing one thing and then realizing you're doing another. And like, okay, so these, this is an exhibition in just gone, but those flat things, which were an exhibition in the German sculptor Thomas Schutter's foundation, they're ceramic pieces which sit on the floor. And I'd started making them, and this is apropos of what we're going to talk about. I'd started making them because I wanted to have a place to put some other works on. I was making bases for, and then, and I thought it would be interesting to have them made out of ceramic because I'd done some other earlier ones that were made out of ceramic, so we made these kind of flat, square things, and and I put the objects that I thought, and they look really stupid, you know, really, really dumb. But then there was a technical problem, that the firing a flat piece of ceramic, it's actually very difficult to get it flat. And the first ones sort of had lifted a bit at the sides. And so to get them flat, we ground off the surface. And then because the clay had a lot of grog in it, fired ceramic mixed in with the clay. When we ground them flat, you had this kind of terrazzo effect. So it was like and I realized that actually what was interesting was that it was a horizontal surface. And then at first I thought just to glaze it, to glaze it with a transparent glaze. But then I also realized that actually glaze behaves very differently on a flat surface than it does on a vertical surface. And I'd done a lot of things which had used the gravity when things are fired to pull the color down the surface of objects. But on a flat surface, the glaze just kind of sits there and puddles and pools. And so they're glazed. They're quite painterly in a way, but they're also. But I could also really load the surface up with a lot of glaze because it wouldn't go away. So so what I was thinking about was kind of revealed by the process of doing something, and then thinking, oh, this is really interesting now, because now I've got I'm working on something that's almost like a painting, or a carpet actually, and I had also been looking at carpets prior to that, so so it kind of chimed in and thinking that, oh, I'd like to make carpets, and so those things kind of came together.
So when I hear you talking about sculpture, I know you have a deep historical knowledge of sculpture, but it seems to me your whole interest is in a way the physicality of the thing, what it's made of, its shape, its appearance. Do you say that's
I wouldn't say that was my whole interest. No.
Okay. I'm interested in it being something else, it kind of being out there in the world. I think it's interesting that it's yes, it's materiality is an important part, and shape is an important part, and but there's also I think language comes into it somehow at some point, when I kind of either telling myself stories about what I'm doing, or naming things, or somehow I think the ways that we talk about things relates to what we see, and that there is some sense in which I think as human beings, the way we negotiate with the world is not only manual but is also linguistic. So that the subject matter is kind of tricky. Is part of your question. I don't. I suppose I think that subject matter becomes revealed rather than you start. It's very difficult to think I'm making a work about love or death, or it's much more, and partly I think that's because big ideas only get smaller, but small ideas get bigger. So that it's better to start from small things, and then they kind of grow in all sorts of different directions. So it can be, things like perception was an issue in the relationship between listening and looking and talking. So those and how reflection, for example, relates
to ideas about looking, how volume or empty volume relates to kind of ideas about resonance, sound, and listening. So all and the connections, the metaphoric connections between those and a human being, you know, or so that a hollow thing resonates, and human beings kind of resonate in a certain sort of way. I'm resonating now. So those are that's, I think, a part of it, as well as materiality.
So
It was a just I didn't like.
So no, that was really, so in a way, the crude question.
Okay, so here there's a work that's called Orinoco.
Right.
And the origins of the work has to do with something very simple about twisting wood, and that over time, as I've twisted pieces of wood, I used to bend pieces of wood by laminating, and then I started using steam to bend them, and then I thought about twisting them, and there is a technical problem. If you twist thick pieces of wood, they tend to split along because the wood's being stretched and compressed. And then a solution to that was to twist them in bunches and then glue the bunches back together again, and then realizing that actually you could separate the bunches and reconfigure them, and that there was something very simple about the twisty wood, which is reminiscent of the ways in which we experience fluidity, or the ways in which we represent fluidity. And even, in fact, if you looked at 18th century stage machinery, they'd use a rotating waveform to represent the kind of sea going up and down. Yeah. So there's some kind of connection between that kind of spiral twist and something like fluidity. And the work is called. It's a very specific experience of traveling down the Orinoco River, so the work, the Orinoco allows the viewer to see this kind of relationship between fluidity and the work. It doesn't really expose all of the attachments of that to a particular experience I had, but that's so there. You know, there is it's kind of partially labelled.
So you're not setting out to make a work about the experience of going down the Orinoco River, but as you're creating the work, in a way, associations and resonances are coming into your mind that add to the work. Do you think? Is that fair?
Correct. That's correct.
Okay.
No. I had got very fascinated by the way in which that very simple twisting of the wood seemed to make the wood appear to be fluid, and that fluidity or liquidity was an interesting state. And that there were having a fluidity within a fixed boundary seemed to provoke all sorts of associations that I find interesting. So you know, there's a number of other works which, within using the same thing, tend to refer to water, and in fact water occurs quite a lot in titles of or fluid related things, and so there's slippery when wet, there's fish out of water, there's troubled water, and so the water is waiting for the rain, you know. So water comes in both as and I think there is a distinction, but there is a connection or a disjunction between stiffness and fluidity, which is a conjunction between life and death, and so that you can invoke, eventually you can kind of start to invoke those kinds of experiences. One called it ecstatic, which is kind of twisted. So the you can get from twisting a piece of wood to ideas about there's a work called Quick, which refers to the quick and the dead, to ideas about life and death quite quickly. And I think material working on the material allows those kinds of metaphorical things to occur. So it may be that the first thing you start with is purely accidental or purely contingent upon trying to solve a technical problem, but what making sculpture does is it opens that up.
Have you ever called any works untitled, or do your works always have a title?
There are 17 untitled
17
works
untitles.
I know this because I'm going to give a recording. I'm doing a recording tomorrow when I have to label, and I'm reading out all the titles of my works in alphabetical order. I happen to know that there are 17 untitled.
I told Richard earlier he should do it to a disco beat. And those works that are untitled, do they, for you, have a similar level of associative meaning or metaphorical meaning, or not?
Yes, they do. I started using titles in. Well, actually, it's untrue. There are works from the early 60s, from the right at the beginning of the time as a student, which have titles. The first title I used tended to be very one word, prosaic, or descriptive, so box, whatever. And then I titled a set of drawings from a line from Rilke's poetry, It's Orpheus when there's singing drawings, and then the works that I made subsequently. The first three were untitled, and then I was making a galvanized steelwork, and it reminded me, and I was thinking about narrative, and the work actually reminded me of Cinderella. I mean, you wouldn't believe that when you saw it, but so the title's called If the Shoe Fits, and that the way in which that it felt more like naming. So naming seemed to become it's also a lot easier to remember things which have got names than it is to remember untitled number 221. You know, and then since I'd been interested in language and the ways in which language and perception were, or the way that language mediate, and I wrote descriptions, and I write anyway, so that it actually seemed like quite a kind of natural way of working with, of continuing the work, and with the untitled pieces, I generally just haven't quite fixed it, so the name, I'm quite good at naming things, but sometimes I've had to give up. Yeah. But interestingly, all of the 17 untitled works are all made in different materials.
So it's not a series of untitled.
No, it's not
right.
true.
So we've been talking about making sculpture, but for the display here, it's been for you mainly about looking at sculpture. And there's one word that I've heard you use more than any other when you've been looking at sculpture. And I think you've only used it once talking about your own working process. Do you know what that word is? The word I associate with you all the time now.
No, I've got no idea what that could
It's
be.
that's, well, it's two words. It's that's interesting.
Oh, right,
You
yeah.
constantly
Yeah,
have
that's
said
interesting.
that. Yeah. So that's partly the origins of my proposition that you're interested in the appearance of things, because you're always looking at things and you say that's interesting, and then you go on to expand on why it's interesting. But it seems to me you manage to have an incredibly almost naive eye always, and approach things completely fresh as a thing that then you find interesting.
I'm trying to remember who the artist was. All the work of art has to do is it has to be interesting. And I can't remember who said that.
No, I don't know. Any offers?
It wasn't Judd, but it was the guy who made the work with the suntan, a book on his chest, and then or it might come back to him. But anyway, so and I understand that as a statement, and that seems to be a perfectly respectable way to look at a work of art and to allow it to take you where you want to go, rather than it telling you stuff.
Let's start by talking about one of the works in the display. I've only picked
Is
one.
it interesting?
It's very, well, you're interested in it. So it's The Sluggard, which will come up in a minute, by Leighton. Let's just wait. I think it comes up quite soon. Not this one. Maybe the next one, or the one after. Yeah, there we are, The Sluggard. So
Why did I like that?
why did you pick it? Why did you like it? What interests you about it? Yeah. Do you need to see it to talk about it? Sorry.
No, I didn't.
Oh, do you want to-
It was very Dennis Oppenheim.
Dennis Oppenheim,
Right.
is that right?
Well done. You get the. Who
was
is that?
that?
Who is that? Yes, it was Dennis Oppenheim who said all the work has to do has to be interesting. The Sluggard. Why did I like that?
Yeah.
Because it's remarkably three-dimensional, and it's got. When you see it in photographs, you think it's only going to have a front. That's what it's all about. But actually, as you move around it, the work continuously reveals different aspects. So it's and there's also a Sluggard. It can't be right, you see, because the body is totally displayed, and is actually in a state of very.
It's this one for people. It'll come up bigger in a minute. There it is from this angle.
It's beautifully modelled, and lithe and alive, and
There it is.
Yeah. So it's someone that's got. If it's someone that's got out of bed, they've got out of bed like a cat waking up. You know, kind of really.
Yeah.
Yeah. It means really ready to go. So why did I pick it? Because I think it's fully in the round, but we have a situation here where you can't get behind the sculpture. So there is a tendency. So I've picked a number of reliefs, which are obviously frontal, and that is both in the display and at a point where it's kind of gyroscopic quality work, so that it you see it walking up, but it also is different coming back. So it acts as a kind of turning point within the display, and I think that's why I chose it. And initially we had it here, in the front, and I realized that actually what it was when I went with Helen to see it. I realized that actually it should be much further back because of that kind of gyroscopic quality to it.
And you were, I think, when you came back after seeing it, you were thinking about whether it should be displayed back to front.
I did, yeah.
Yeah. And where are you on that at the moment? Is it wait and see till we get
to decide
yeah.
orientation. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I found a nice quote about it on our website, actually, and it says, Giuseppe Vallona, the model, a man of fine proportions, weary one day of posing in the studio, threw himself back, stretched out his arms and gave a great yawn. So he was life modelling and got too stiff. Leighton saw the whole performance and fixed it roughly in clay straight off. So I suppose Leighton thought, that's interesting, grabbed his clay and made it. And it then tells us, I mean, I think this is not necessarily strictly accurate because it's from an early biography, but Leighton initially titled the sculpture An Athlete Awakening from Sleep, but may have felt that the new title better emphasised the languid mood of the piece. So, quite nice.
Well, An Athlete Waking from Sleep is a kind of boring title. Sluggard is quite
it's
nice.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a nice word too.
It is. A nice concept, actually. It's my ambition to be more of a sluggard, I think. So, it's not finished yet, the sculpture display, and in my experience, the greatest fun is the actual installation and then showing it to people afterwards. But I'm intrigued by which aspects of it you've enjoyed or found interesting or intriguing so far. I know you've done, there's a couple of slides, aren't there, where you've done sculpture displays at Tate and at the Carnegie Museum, is that right?
The Carnegie in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, so I just wondered, working on this one or on those ones really, what is it that interests you about selecting and arranging things?
Well, in the Carnegie, and this is like 25 years ago, it was Lynn Cook and Mark Francis who invited me to be in between the Carnegie International and the collection. So I wasn't really in the show and I wasn't in the collection, so they wanted me to be in between. And being in between is also a position...
In the physical space in between?
Yeah, it's kind of on the border.
Yeah.
And being an in-between is actually, as Lynn and Mark both knew, is also a phrase or a thing that I have talked about. So and I thought of making that my contribution was both selection and display. And I spent a long time going through the Carnegie, but also I made these three...
Yes, I think it's the one after this, isn't it? Is it?
Coming up.
That one, yeah.
So I made these three islands, three kind of places to put things, selected from the collection. In one, these are mostly 19th century objects from the decorative arts. On the second, the sort of the steel one at the back, these were wooden objects one was a chair, one was a Noguchi sculpture, so it was a Rietveld chair, a Noguchi sculpture, and a sculpture by a Kenyan artist that was named, that had been collected in the 50s. So there was three, and there were three very different uses of the same material. And then the last one was a David Smith, which I put on a carpet, a sort of vinyl carpet, which was a bit contentious, although in fact the museum itself had treated the David Smith very transiently. It kind of moved it around the place. And all of them were in different ways kind of bases for the sculpture. There was a fourth element which I'd wanted to include, which was a Parthenon model, which is in the Carnegie collection, which had a little door in it. So it was a kind of big model of the Parthenon, and I'd wanted to have that, but with the door open, so you could kind of go inside the model.
Oh, it's a big enough model you can walk in.
Could walk into the. We could walk into this kind of broom cupboard space. But it was too complicated to move it. But so that was the beginning, and there was some conversation between the materials that I used and the materials, or some disjunctions between the materials I used and the ways in which decorative material references to natural objects. It was one of them was a spoon, which was like a mussel, an oyster shell tied to a piece of string, tied to a piece of wood, but actually all done in fine silver. You know, it's kind of so the. And I think the thing that had provoked my interest in that was the Palozzi show in the Museum of Mankind here, called Seven Magic Kingdoms, Lost Magic Kingdoms, where he also selected with very selected very without telling a story, without following an anthropological narrative, but had just selected things that he found intriguing or interesting, to use the word, from the British Museum stores, and which I always thought was a fantastic show. And it did correspond to the ways that I thought I used museums. And the other example, the other thing would be the Horniman Museum in South London, which, like the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, is a museum where the showcases are organised around ideas rather than necessarily chronologically. And if you know the Pitt Rivers, that's how it works. So that, like, drug taking can be an idea, and then you see it through different cultures, and you pass through down through chronology. So there are. There are examples of other ways of organising museum displays or collection displays, which don't necessarily have to correspond to chronology, and which can indicate ways in which things that are apparently different can talk to each other.
And has that been a guiding principle in your selection and arrangement for this area?
More or less, yes. Although there is a tendency for chronology to go from here down to there. So not absolute, but I mean, there is a slight. It's not completely clear, but the earliest things tend to be at this end. The most recent stuff is at the other end.
But that's not strict, is it? No.
In between the period is it's not necessarily chronology that determines the relationship between any subgroup within the show. So a group of three portraits can are there because of their similarity and difference.
And are there beyond its an interesting work, are there other criteria that have come into your mind about what you've chosen or what you've rejected?
Well, I'd wanted to have abstraction and figuration as strongly represented I could. The Academy's collection is more figurative than abstract. I'd wanted a variety of materials inevitably, you know, that's probably about it in terms of.
I noticed I scribbled a note when we spoke about it once, and you said for this area, you said, I like things with nice contours in the space, and I seem to like things with clear silhouettes in the space, which I think is probably a reaction to the nature of the space, where everything is displayed against the window or the blinds, isn't it?
Yes. There was also the opportunity to show things to which I hadn't seen, which are like the Flaxman, the big Flaxman reliefs, which are long and beautifully. I've always liked Flaxman because of the precision of the line, so yeah, there was certainly the opportunity to have things that weren't that I hadn't seen to expose them, and not everything that I might have wanted can be shown because the conditions here are harsh.
So that it gets very, very hot up here and can get quite dry. And so, you're telling me a couple of minutes, yeah, so that does limit what you can show up here. And also the light levels get so high that anything that's going to fade in any way or the material is going to change, you can't have up here.
Joe Tilson gave a group of 4 wooden objects, which are in the end. So actually, having said that the oldest ones are at this end, it's not true. The Joe Tilson ones, which fit perfectly within the 4 spaces down there, and they immediately solved a problem of both what could go there, having something made of wood in the space, and increasing the presence of abstract things. So the Tilsons actually kind of hit a lot of nails on the head for me.
I think we should move to some questions. Does that suit you?
Yeah, it suits me.
Okay. Comments?
But there may not be
questions?
any, of course. No.
That was a very definite no.
Yeah, there was a definite no. I've never included in any show that I've curated. I've never included any of my own work, apart from so in the Tate, I designed the plinths, and in the Carnegie, I designed the plinths, and here presumably I will also have input into the design of the plinths. But for example, when I did the abstract drawing show in the drawing room, I didn't. It felt that being a curator and being an artist seemed to be different things, and including your self-selecting your own work. I find a bit awkward, a bit uncomfortable.
Any questions, thoughts, reactions? Yeah.
What was it easy? Did you have to anguish over every?
It was pleasurable. I wouldn't so it wasn't, and in that sense it was easy. And there are several stages in the first kind of selection was really quite was really quite quick. and which was then refined and adjusted and moved around and visiting the collection, which is stored out somewhere in the marshes of East London, was
In a dry bit of the marshes.
oh, yeah. Was extraordinarily pleasurable, and there were all sorts of things that I saw there that I would have that I found fascinating, but which couldn't be included. Some of which are going to be shown in other places, drawing aids. Kind of, there's a whole lot of hands and feet and animal paws and things which have little hooks so that they could be attached to the wall, so they could be used as drawing aids. And there's also, and I think someone's going to do a show of this. There's also lots of paraphernalia, which I hadn't looked at because it was, I mean, it's listed, but it hadn't been part of what I was looking at. But there's lots of paraphernalia from earlier artists, and there's also a lot of there are a number of items of a sort of slightly unknown provenance, which are equally interesting.
My favourite item at the moment is we've got a few wonderful outfits that early academicians wore. So we got out Joshua Reynolds' long velvet jacket the other day, which is just fantastic. Yeah. I want to have the head of collection ceremonial uniform made for 2018 so I can dress in velvet. Any more questions? Helen, do you want to say anything? It's Helen who's been working with Richard the most closely.
The first studio I had in Brixton was at 52 Acre Lane. 52 Acre Lane was an old factory that stretched back from the road. And when I was a student at the Royal College in my last year, I began looking for a studio. This abandoned building was just around the corner from where I lived. And I began the process of finding out who owned it and whether it would be possible to rent a part of it for a studio. And it turned out that it belonged to the ILEA, as was, and it was surplus to requirements because it had been bought for the school next door in case of expanding school roles, but the school roles at the time, and this was in the end of the 70s, were falling. So there were a number of parcels of land which were surplus to requirements, and the GLC, the Greater London Council Valuer, was very sympathetic to the idea of renting the space, but not a part of it, so it had to be the whole of it. And then I involved Acme Housing Association in saying that there was this factory building that was available, would make great studios, and if I could have the choice, then would they help me taking it on. And the building that I'd wanted was actually between a Georgian house at the front and the rest of the factory at the back, and had been roofed over. With a glass roof and a sliding door in the front to form a kind of garage. And so the building was kind of inside out. And inside the building were, inside my studio, there were windowsills from the building next door. Sort of,
From the outside windowsills.
Outside windowsills. And also the gutter ran inside. So the building was kind of, had this kind of very inside-out quality, and which I think had a big effect on the way that my work developed, that kind of both the in-between idea and that kind of inside-out. So the idea that this space is an outside space become inside is fits very well with with some of the ways that I think about sculpture and the way it occupies space. So that to think of these as this display space as a pediment for an outdoor display, but somehow kind of turned inside kind of works for me. I've always liked this shelf because of that, because of its kind of liminality and its because of its liminality. The other day when I went round or a few weeks ago when I went round the building site, I went out on the other side of Burlington Gardens, up on between the sculptures and where the sculptures on the building. I went along the scaffolding between, and it also felt a bit like it felt a bit like this. So I think it's Helen. I think the answer is that what makes it a space is its in-betweenness.
Perhaps we've got a title emerging for the display. I think unless there's any other questions, I think that would be a good place to leave it. Okay, well, thank you very much.